In the summer of 1956, a young United States Senator, John F. Kennedy, talks about his political career.
Well, I suppose I'm prejudiced, but I must say that I found it to be a wonderful job. I suppose I had good luck. I came out of the Navy in 1945 and then ran for Congress in 46 and served there for 3 terms and then came to the Senate. I think it offers a tremendous opportunity for anyone, so that I'm enthusiastic about my work, and I think, and I hope to continue it, but of course no one can tell in this business how long you're going to survive.
By 1956, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had already survived and flourished for 10 years in politics, and had also lived through the violence and bitterness of war. This will be the story of those early years, of the development of Kennedy's ideas, as well as his career, of the interplay between his personal experience and the large events of his time, a war and the difficult and uneasy peace that followed. During those years, he wrote,
"Without belittling the courage of men who have died, we should not forget those acts of courage with which men have lived. The courage of life is often a less dramatic spectacle than the courage of a final moment, but it is no less a magnificent mixture of triumph and tragedy. A man does what he must in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures, and that is the basis of all human morality."
In the fall of 1938, John F. Kennedy was beginning his junior year at Harvard University. He had been an average student, bright, inquisitive, an avid reader of history and current events, but without any serious interest in his studies. Winter vacations were usually spent in Florida at the family's resort home in Palm Beach. The Kennedys were millionaires, but the children had been brought up to regard money as a means, not an end. And there had been a toughness and discipline to their upbringing that was not evident in the comfort of their surroundings. The Kennedys were a competitive family, unwilling to settle for second best at anything. But they were also a warm family, fiercely loyal to each other in dealing with the outside world, and more than most families, bound together by love. Early in 1939, after spending the winter vacation in Palm Beach with his family, John Kennedy flew north, and in February sailed for Europe. Harvard had allowed him to spend the school term abroad, and during the spring and summer of 1939, he traveled through Europe and the Middle East. He wrote a detailed report about each country he visited, using the American embassies as temporary offices, and forwarded the reports to his father, the American ambassador to Great Britain. In the summer of 1939, England, finally awake to the possibility of war, was busy preparing its defenses. And on September 1st, with the German invasion of Poland, war came. The day war was declared, a German submarine torpedoed the British liner Athenia. 300 Americans were among her passengers, part of the first wave of evacuees from England, and 30 were lost. John Kennedy was sent to Glasgow by his father to meet the survivors. His assignment was to get the full facts about what had happened and to do what little he could to help. For one small group of Americans, the introduction to war had come early. For the British, it would soon follow. Transatlantic clipper service had just begun in 1939, and in late September, John Kennedy flew back to the United States to begin his senior year in college. Working at Harvard's Widener Library, he put to use the observations and insights he had gained from his 8 months abroad. That winter, he concentrated on writing an honors thesis entitled Appeasement at Munich. The essay was so well received that Kennedy decided to expand it and try to get it published. The result was a book called Why England Slept, which soon became a bestseller, a heady experience for a 23-year-old. Why England Slept was anything but frivolous. It examined the years that Hitler was building Germany into a great and threatening military power, and attempted to evaluate, with almost clinical detachment, the reasons for Britain's failure to respond. In viewing the appeasement of Hitler at Munich, the young author refused to place the burden of blame on Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the British leaders who had preceded him.
To dismiss the matter purely as a question of poor leadership would mean that America would lose the benefit of the experience England has been going through. I believe it's one of democracy's failures that it seeks to make scapegoats for its own weaknesses.
At a time in 1940 when America was in the first stages of her own hasty and delayed rearmament program, the author summed up what he believed was the fundamental issue involved.
I say, therefore, that democracy's weaknesses are great in competing with a totalitarian system. Democracy is the superior form of government because it's based on a respect for man as a reasonable being. For the long run, then, democracy is superior. But for the short run, democracy has great weaknesses. When it competes with a system of government which cares nothing for permanency, a system built primarily for war, democracy, which is built primarily for peace, is at a disadvantage. Now that the world is ablaze, America has awakened to the problems facing it. We should profit by the lesson of England and make our democracy work. Any system of government will work when everything is going well. It's the system that functions in the pinches that survives.
In the fall of 1940, with all of Europe lying at the feet of Hitler's armies, America began the first peacetime military draft in its history. The country was moving toward war, and young Americans of military age tried to enjoy the little time that was left. In later years, John Kennedy would be haunted by the poignancy of men dying young, by the hero's death of his brother Joe, for whom there was such promise, his sister Kathleen, whose husband would be killed in the war, and who would herself die in a plane crash soon afterward, Bill Coleman Jr. from Harvard, also to die in the war. All of these tragedies would become part of John Kennedy's continuing preoccupation with courage and with death. But in the spring of 1941, they were all in the future. 9 months before Pearl Harbor, John Kennedy tried to enlist in the Army, but was rejected because of a back injury he had suffered while playing football at Harvard. He went through 5 months of strengthening exercises, and in September was accepted by the Navy and commissioned an ensign. After Pearl Harbor, he applied for sea duty, and early in 1943 was sent to the South Pacific, to the naval base at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, where he waited for an assignment. Soon he was made commander of his own PT boat. His act of heroism as the skipper of PT 109 is familiar to every American. With characteristic understatement, he would later dismiss it with, "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." But the courage, endurance, and leadership he displayed after his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer constituted one of the outstanding acts of heroism in a war that knew many heroes. Plagued by back trouble and malaria, John Kennedy returned to the United States and was hospitalized. Early in 1945, he was discharged from service. In February, when the Big Three were meeting at Yalta to shape the post-war world, Kennedy wrote down some of his own thoughts about peace and the possibility of controlling armaments after the war.
At the end of this war, we will have only 3 countries, the USSR, Britain, and the United States, in a position to wage total war. There will, of course, have to be a strong growth of mutual trust between these countries before any comprehensive plan can be worked out.
While realizing the difficulties of arms control, he saw the need as an urgent one. Some 6 months before Hiroshima, he speculated about the German V-2 bombs.
It is not an exaggeration to expect that these missiles will be developed to a point where, theoretically, any spot on the globe can send to any community in the world with pinpoint accuracy a silent but frightful message of death and destruction. One does not have to be a Jules Verne to visualize the death of the human race, a victim of science and moral degeneracy.
But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination: to find a way to end wars.
In June 1945, Kennedy went to San Francisco as a special writer for the Hearst Press to cover the founding of the United Nations. For a young idealist with recent memories of war, the experience was somewhat disenchanting. In a letter to a friend, he wrote,
"When I think of how much this war has cost us, of the deaths of Cy and Peter and Orv and Gil and Demi and Joe and Billy and all of those thousands and millions who have died with them, when I think of all those gallant acts that I have seen or anyone has seen who has been to the war, it would be a very easy thing to feel disappointed and somewhat betrayed. You've seen battlefields where sacrifice was the order of the day, and to compare that sacrifice to the timidity and selfishness of the nations gathered at San Francisco must inevitably be disillusioning."
Yet Kennedy wondered if the conference could have been expected to achieve more. The truth was that people, as well as nations, were at fault.
The international relinquishing of sovereignty would have to spring from the people. It would have to be so strong that the elected delegates would be turned out of office if they failed to do it. We must face the truth that the people have not been horrified by war to a sufficient extent to force them to go to any extent rather than have another war. War will exist until that distant day when the conscientious objector enjoys the same reputation and prestige that the warrior does today.
At the end of the war, John Kennedy looked almost as young as his 2 surviving brothers. But he was 28 years old and still undecided about his future direction The choice seemed to lie between writing and politics. After the death of Joe Kennedy, Jr., Ambassador Kennedy had been urging his son John to enter politics. And although he had mixed feelings about a political career, early in 1946, John Kennedy filed in the primaries against 9 opponents for the Democratic nomination for Congress, representing Boston's 11th Congressional District. He began to do those things a young politician does, joining the Knights of Columbus, becoming active in the community fund, and practicing being effective. Kennedy learned campaigning as he campaigned. At first, he was awkward as a public speaker and did much better talking informally with small groups. He tried to meet as many people as possible and to cover every inch of his district, spending an average of 14 hours a day campaigning. In spite of his shyness, he did well. The factory workers and longshoremen liked his war record. And the Kennedy charm and social standing appealed to the women voters. He won the primary by a large margin, as well as the election that followed. And on January 3rd, 1947, at the opening of the 80th Congress, John F. Kennedy was one of 435 members sworn into the United States House of Representatives. Confronting the 80th Congress were all the problems of the post-war world. Europe was still in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, factories silent, people jobless and hungry. The Iron Curtain of Soviet domination was already drawn across much of Europe. In France and Italy, communists took to the streets against governments weakened by post-war chaos. In Greece, Soviet-supported guerrillas were fighting in the hills and in the cities, and Russian pressure was increasing on Turkey as well. The United States was faced with an historic choice: to abandon America's traditional isolationism or to abandon Greece and Turkey. President Truman gave the answer.
Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States.
In 1947, after 150 years of peacetime isolation, the United States embarked on a policy of involvement in the problems of Europe to contain communism and, with the Marshall Plan, to rebuild democracy.
There is no room in America for those who would destroy America. There is no room in the government of the United States.
Spurred by the sharpening hostilities and suspicions of the Cold War, Americans became increasingly preoccupied with the internal threat of communism. The aura of espionage surrounding the perjury trial of Alger Hiss, a respected former State Department official, seemed to lend substance to people's fears. The case also created a reputation for Richard Nixon, the young congressman who helped bring Hiss to trial. And in 1950, a freshman senator from Wisconsin made instant headlines by launching charges of wholesale espionage in government.
Of that group in the State Department that's sabotaging our foreign policy. Now, let me say this. You can buy spies. The little fellow who will sell his country for 30 pieces of silver, he is not the most dangerous man. It's those men in the top level of our government and in the second echelon who do the planning and the shaping of our foreign policy. They're the dangerous men, whether they're getting 30 pieces of silver or not.
McCarthy's charges brought immediate and angry replies from those accused.
It is impossible for anyone to estimate the harmful effect that these innuendos have had on the success of my mission and the foreign policy of the United States. I therefore conclude that Senator McCarthy's charges and insinuations are not only false, but utterly irresponsible, and under the circumstances reveal a shocking disregard for the interests of our country.
A Senate committee promptly investigated McCarthy's charges and could find no substance to them. In 1951, Congressman John Kennedy was not among those who were dominated by the fear of communists in government.
And I think that the stories of communism within the executive branch of the government have more or less died out, and I think that determined efforts have been made to rid the executive branch of the government of the communists, and I think it's been done on the whole.
By 1951, John Kennedy had been in Congress during 4 eventful years. On the great issues of foreign policy, he had supported the administration. At home, McCarthyism was not one of his issues. He was less concerned with what he saw as abstract questions of individual liberty than he was with the more tangible matters that affected the daily lives of his constituents. Higher minimum wage provisions, broadened Social Security, expanded low-cost housing. These were the kinds of issues that occupied his attention and interest at the time. Perhaps the most significant event of the congressional years was a trip Kennedy made late in 1951 to the Middle East and Asia. The trip introduced him to a vast area of the world, whose potential and whose massive problems he had dimly realized. It changed his thinking. On his return to Congress, he said,
Mr. Chairman, last year I offered a motion to cut technical assistance in the Middle East. But this fall I had an opportunity to visit that area in Southeast Asia, and I think we would be making a tremendous mistake to cut this money out of the bill. Many of us feel that the United States has concentrated too much on Western Europe. The life expectancy of people in India is 26 or 27 years, and they are increasing at the rate of 5 million a year, a rate much faster than the available food supply. The communists have a chance of seizing all of Asia in the next 5 or 6 years. What weapons do we have that will stop them? The most effective is technical assistance. It gives them some hope, at least, that their problems can be solved without turning to the communists. We are planning to spend a very large amount of money in this area for military assistance, which is of secondary importance compared to this program.
In 1951, the war that was then called the Indochina War, and would later be called the Vietnam War, had been in progress for 5 years. During his world trip, Congressman Kennedy spent 10 days in Indochina. His observations were critical.
In Indochina, we have allied ourselves to the desperate effort of a French regime to hang on to the remnants of empire. There's no broad general support of the native Vietnam government among the people of that area. To check the southern drive of communism makes sense, but not only through reliance on the force of arms. The task is rather to build strong native non-communist sentiment within these areas and rely on that as a spearhead of defense rather than upon the legions of General de Lattre. To do this apart from and in defiance of innately nationalistic aims spells foredoomed failure.
Throughout his trip, John Kennedy saw the visible signs of poverty and also sensed the hidden undercurrents of resentment.
Nearly all these countries, stretching from Morocco in the Atlantic Ocean to the Philippines on the other side, have been under the domination of Western European powers or the United States in the last 35 years, and some still are, and we are closely tied with those, what they consider to be imperialist powers. And as it's a drive against the white race, and we are perhaps the strongest of the countries that might be considered that way to the Asiatics, we have fallen heir to much of the hatred that they incurred by their policy. Secondly, I think our policies have not been too wise since the end of the war. And in the third place, we are a strong power and a rich country, and therefore I think there's a natural animosity that goes with that sort of power, especially when we try to impose our will on these countries.
When you returned from your trip, you made a speech, and in it you said that our representatives abroad, and I quote, were unconscious of the fact that their role was not tennis and cocktails, but the interpretation to a foreign country of the meaning of American life.
As I said in that, which you read from that speech, I said that a lot of our representatives are doing an excellent job under very difficult conditions. On the other hand, I think too many of our representatives are, use the words playing tennis and cocktails. I think, but more basically, that quotation would continue in not knowing the country to which they are accredited, knowing very little of the people, very little of the language and the customs, not really representing what we would like to feel are the representative American types in the Foreign Service. I think that this has been something that's been talked about for 20 years, but I think that it's something that ought to be done about. I think there's a lot of young men who are very interested in going in the Foreign Service. I don't know where they got a lot of the ones that I saw.
During much of his stay in Congress, John Kennedy left Washington on Thursdays and flew up to Boston to spend long weekends traveling around Massachusetts, building a statewide image. And in April 1952, when he announced his candidacy for the United States Senate, the months of arduous campaigning that lay ahead only meant intensifying what he had already been doing for 3 years. Those who saw him only casually during the campaign had no idea of the ordeal the candidate was going through. Kennedy's relaxed smile belied the obvious evidence of his crutches, and only those close to him knew of the excruciating pain that his back was causing much of the time. The Democratic candidate for president in '52, Adlai Stevenson.
I think he's going to carry Massachusetts, and I think when he does, that he's going to help everyone who's running as a Democrat. You're all set to give him a big...
Although Kennedy voiced optimism about Stevenson's chances, he knew he was far from the favorite.
I think it's been very good, and I think he's discussed the issues very honestly.
Dwight Eisenhower was running well ahead, and his campaign manager, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., was Kennedy's opponent in the Senate race. But if Lodge had Eisenhower, Kennedy had his own secret weapon. Throughout the state, he held a series of receptions. In each city, the women who had been invited represented a carefully selected cross-section of the community. The emphasis was more on personality than on politics. All told, some 50,000 women turned out to be impressed by the Kennedy family, as well as by the candidate himself, and to pass the word along. Kennedy beat Lodge by a narrow margin, and many observers felt that the receptions had made the difference. On January 3rd, 1953, John F. Kennedy became a United States Senator.
So help me God.
And on January 20th, Dwight D. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States.
But I realized that...
Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democratic leader of the Senate, now presided over a minority.
New to the Democrats in the minority.
For the first time in 20 years, the Republican Party controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress. Robert Taft ruled the Senate. and Joseph McCarthy was about to move to the peak of his power. In the Soviet Union, the year 1953 was also a year of change. On March 5th, Joseph Stalin died. Millions of Russians came for a last look at the man who had ruled communism for almost 30 years. The struggle for power among those who saw themselves as Stalin's heirs was already beginning. It would take 3 years to resolve. But uncertainty in the Kremlin did not alter the reality of Russian military might. And in 1953, this increased immeasurably with the first Russian hydrogen bomb. In the Far East, the summer of 1953 brought final peace to Korea. The war ended exactly where it had begun, at the 38th parallel. During 1953, Senator Kennedy led his usual active life, politically and athletically. One of the biggest social events of 1953 was the wedding on September 12th of Jacqueline Bouvier of Newport, Rhode Island, and Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. For years, John Kennedy had been considered one of the country's most eligible bachelors. Now, with his marriage, there was a great deal of curiosity about the lovely woman who had become his bride.
How long did you know each other before you were married?
We knew each other about a year.
Are you a native, Washingtonian?
No, I was born in New York.
And your maiden name?
Jacqueline Bouvier.
Bouvier. French?
That's right.
Where did you go on your honeymoon?
We went to Acapulco, Mexico.
Do any fishing?
Yes, my husband caught a 10-foot sailfish, which he has in his office.
A real prize catch. Did you help him haul it in?
Well, not really, but I was in the boat. All I did was pour water on him.
You poured water on him?
Yes.
You say him, you mean the fish?
Well, no,
the fish
my husband.
On your husband?
Because it was so hot in that boiling sun, and he had to fight the fish for about 3 hours. So I just stayed there pouring water on him and giving him Coca-Cola.
Is fishing one of your hobbies? Well, I have done a lot of fishing, off and on through the years. Some down off Florida some time ago. Then during our honeymoon, we went to Mexico, and I fished down there. Well, if your husband should suddenly decide someday to leave politics, where would you like to live?
Well, I suppose in Boston, because, well, that's where he comes from and where he belongs. I suppose any other place he'd be sort of drifting.
You want to be with him?
Yes.
You're pretty much in love with him, aren't you?
Oh.
Well, Senator, to mix a little romance with politics, where did you meet your wife? Oh, I met her 3 years ago at a dinner here in Washington. She used to be the inquiring photographer for the Times-Herald at that time. She was in journalism at the time. Was it a case of love at first sight? Well, I don't know whether... I don't know how you would describe those, but anyway, I was very interested.
As a senator, John Kennedy continued to travel around Massachusetts. But now the focus was on learning, not campaigning, and his curiosity was insatiable. His main concerns were those of Massachusetts, problems of industrial decay and low-wage competition from the South. And he also began to reflect seriously about the meaning of being a politician. He observed,
all of us in the Senate live in an iron lung, the iron lung of politics. It's no easy task to emerge from that rarefied atmosphere in order to breathe the same fresh air our constituents breathe. In truth, I rarely know how the great majority of the voters feel, or even how much they know of the issues that seem so burning in Washington. Today, the challenge of political courage looms larger than ever before. Our political life is becoming so expensive, so mechanized, and so dominated by professional politicians and public relations men that the idealist who dreams of independent statesmanship is rudely awakened by the necessities of election and accomplishment. And our public life is becoming so increasingly centered upon that seemingly unending war to which we've given the curious epithet cold, that we tend to encourage rigid ideological unity and orthodox patterns of thought. Of course, it would be much easier if we could all continue to think in traditional political patterns of liberalism and conservatism, as Republicans and Democrats, management and labor, or some equally narrow framework. But today, this nation cannot tolerate the luxury of such lazy political habits. Only the strength and progress and peaceful change that come from independent judgment and individual ideas, and even from the unorthodox and the eccentric, can enable us to surpass that foreign ideology that fears free thought more than it fears hydrogen bombs. We shall need compromises in the days ahead, to be sure. But these will be, or should be, compromises of issues, not of principles. We can compromise our political positions, but not ourselves.
By the early 1950s, America had developed the world's first global bomber, the B-36. Its nuclear striking power led to a new foreign policy, de-emphasizing the reliance on conventional forces to contain communism.
This would be to have strength nowhere and bankruptcy everywhere. That, however, does not mean that we must abandon the whole idea of collective security and merely build our own defense area. Our capacity to retaliate must be, and I assure you it is, massive.
John Kennedy had always advocated a strong defense program, but like others, he questioned a policy that relied too heavily on nuclear deterrence. Soon after a hydrogen bomb test in the Pacific on March 1st, 1954, had created unexpected fallout hazards, he delivered a Senate speech.
I think we now more fully realize the implications of the hydrogen age. The fear of a nuclear war in which no nation would be victor and all nations would be victims has radically altered the significance of a military program which relies primarily upon massive retaliatory power. For if the United States can meet aggression only by risking hydrogen warfare, we hand an advantage to the aggressor nation willing to achieve its conquest by methods short of those inducing us to take that risk. Our reduction of strength for resistance in so-called brush fire wars, while threatening atomic retaliation, has in effect invited expansion by the communists in areas such as Indochina.
By March 1954, the brush fire war in Indochina was almost 8 years old, and the French position had deteriorated. Hoping to draw the communist guerrillas into decisive open battle, the French made a stand at the fortress of Dien Bien Phu. But by mid-March, the French forces were surrounded and cut off. Military aid from the United States had made it possible for France to maintain the war. But in spite of an ever-increasing flow of supplies, the French cause appeared doomed. The question of American military intervention was raised.
This might have serious risks, but these risks are far less than would face us a few years from now if we dare not be resolute today.
Senator Kennedy felt otherwise.
I am reluctant to make any statement which may be misinterpreted as unappreciative of the gallant French struggle at Dien Bien Phu and elsewhere. But the speeches of President Eisenhower and Secretary Dulles and others have left too much unsaid. For if the American people are, for the fourth time in this century, to travel the long and tortuous road of war, particularly a war which we now realize would threaten the survival of civilization, then I believe we have a right to inquire in detail into the nature of the struggle in which we may become engaged. Certainly, I, for one, favor a policy of united action by many nations, whenever necessary, to achieve a military and political victory for the free world in that area, realizing full well that it may require some commitment of manpower. But to pour money, material, and men into the jungles of Indochina without at least a remote prospect of victory would be dangerously futile and self-destructive. Of course, all discussions of united action assume the inevitability of such victory. But such assumptions are not unlike similar predictions of confidence which have lulled the American people for many years. I am frankly of the belief that no amount of American military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere, an enemy of the people which has the sympathy and covert support of the people. If the French persist in their refusal to grant the legitimate independence and freedom desired by the peoples of the Associated States, and if those peoples and the other peoples of Asia remain aloof from the conflict as they have in the past, then it is my hope that Secretary Dulles will recognize the futility of channeling American men and machines into that hopeless struggle.
America did not intervene, and the Indochina War was settled at the conference table by partition. On July 20th, the opposing generals signed a ceasefire order. As a result of the Geneva Agreement, North Vietnam became a communist state. And into newly created South Vietnam came the remnants of the French army. And hundreds of thousands of refugees. So ended the longest war of the 20th century, for a while. In the United States, former Governor Earl Warren of California had become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And on May 17, 1954, the Warren Court announced the historic decision outlawing segregation in schools. And while a new era in civil rights was beginning, another era was coming to a close with the Army McCarthy hearings of the spring of 1954.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
On the issue of Senator McCarthy, John Kennedy's position had been no better and no worse than that of most Democratic senators, including the liberals. Although he had never taken an active stand against McCarthy himself, he had never given the slightest support to McCarthyism and had consistently opposed the Wisconsin senator on specific questions of civil liberties and other issues. In later years, he would say,
the whole McCarthy episode must be judged in the perspective of the atmosphere which has always prevailed in the Senate, where most members are reluctant to judge personally the conduct of another. Perhaps that was wrong in McCarthy's case. Perhaps we were not as sensitive as some and should have acted sooner. That is a reasonable indictment that falls on me as well.
The senator has quite evidently placed himself in the contempt of his peers.
In August, after the Army McCarthy hearings, the Senate considered a resolution to censure McCarthy. John Kennedy was prepared to vote for censure. But instead of voting, the Senate formed a select committee to consider the charges. During that summer, Kennedy had suffered increasing pain. And on October 21st, he entered the hospital to undergo a difficult and dangerous spinal operation. He was still in the hospital when the Senate voted on December 2nd to condemn McCarthy on the basis of his behavior during the committee hearings. Without question, Senator Kennedy would have joined in the vote against McCarthy if he had been present. The operation had not been successful. He had been so close to death that last rites had been administered. And although he was now leaving for the friendlier climate of Palm Beach, a winter of torture and near death still lay ahead. When John Kennedy returned to the Senate in the spring of 1955, he had been absent for 7 months. During those months, the closeness to death, the long period of enforced idleness and reflection, had hastened his private crisis of identity. He emerged better focused, more serious, more formidable. The next year was a time of concentration on work and politics. And his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage, gave him recognition as a writer and an intellectual. By the summer of 1956, with the Democratic Convention close at hand, he was already being questioned about his availability for the vice presidential nomination.
Well, I would first say that I would assume that it would be difficult for anybody to refuse, and that I would accept if I were asked. But I must say in all honesty that I don't think I'm going to be asked.
Do you have any political ambitions for your husband? You know, he's being mentioned as a possible nominee, vice presidential nominee.
Well, just whatever he has for himself, I have for him.
Would you like to be the wife of a vice presidential nominee?
Well, if he wanted to be the vice presidential nominee, I'd like being his wife.
Kennedy had been undecided about entering the race for the vice presidency. His supporters urged that the nomination would bring him national prominence. On the other hand, if the Democrats were to lose the election, as seemed probable, his career would suffer. A great deal depended on Adlai Stevenson. As expected, he won the presidential nomination, but instead of picking his running mate, he left the choice to the convention. Kennedy decided to enter the free-for-all and quickly organized a campaign. Tennessee's Estes Kefauver was expected to win, but on the second ballot, Kennedy moved into the lead.
Texas proudly casts its vote for that fighting sailor who wears the scars of battle, and that fearless senator, the next vice president of the United States, John Kennedy of Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, Pennsylvania wishes to cast its entire 74 votes for Estes Kefauver.
After a heartbreaking climax, in which he moved to within 68 votes of victory, Kennedy lost. It was his first political defeat.
Ladies and gentlemen of this convention, I want to take this opportunity first to express my appreciation to Democrats from all parts of the country, north and south, east and west, who have been so generous and kind to me this afternoon, recognizing that this convention has selected a man who has campaigned in all parts of the country, who has worked entirely for the party.
A nation watched John F. Kennedy in defeat and liked what it saw. And from the triumph of that defeat in 1956 emerged the presidential candidate of 1960.
I can assure all of you here who have reposed this confidence in me that I will be worthy of your trust. We will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
John F. Kennedy was President of the United States for a little over 1,000 days. It's difficult to assess the true measure of his accomplishments during that tragically brief term. But any assessment must take into account more than the obvious yardsticks of crises faced and legislation passed. There are intangibles as well. And it is largely to these we shall address ourselves during the next hour. Some have called it the Kennedy style, a misleading word, for the style and the substance were inseparable. The late Adlai Stevenson touched on it in his eulogy after the president's death.
President Kennedy was so contemporary a man, so involved in our world, so immersed in our times, so responsive to its challenges, that he seemed the very symbol of the vitality and the exuberance that is the essence of life itself.
January 20th, 1961. For the first time since Theodore Roosevelt, the nation enjoyed the excitement of a young president with a young family. In the early months, there were news stories about the busy activities of the new administration and bulletins about crises in the Congo and in Laos. But most Americans had their attention elsewhere, on the President and the First Lady. Few men had come to the presidency as well prepared as John Kennedy, and few had sought it as actively. However, as with any new president, it came as an entirely new experience.
It's a tremendous change to go from being a senator to being president. In the first months, it's very difficult. So that I would say that the problems are more difficult than I imagined them to be. The responsibilities placed in the United States are greater than I imagined them to be, and there are greater limitations upon our ability to bring about a favorable result than I had imagined them to be. And I think that's probably true of anyone who becomes president, because there is such a difference between those who advise or speak or legislate and between the man who must select from the various alternatives proposed and say that this shall be the policy of the United States. It's much easier to make the speeches than it is to finally make the judgments, because unfortunately your advisors are frequently divided. If you take the wrong course, and on occasion I have, the president bears the burden, responsibility quite rightly. The advisors may move on to new advice.
The president's first drastic decision involved Cuba and resulted in the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. The Eisenhower administration had bequeathed the new president a force of anti-Castro exiles, training in Guatemala for an invasion of their homeland. Under pressure from his senior advisors, Kennedy gave his approval to the invasion. The CIA had organized the training of the guerrillas and had forcefully advocated the invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense had approved its military aspects, and the Secretary of State had approved its political aspects. Yet, everything went wrong.
I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive.
The Bay of Pigs was a painful initiation, but its lessons were well learned. Thereafter, the president would rely less on the experts and more on his own people and himself. No office in the world holds more honor or greater importance than the presidency of the United States. President Kennedy was fully aware of the responsibility and dignity that his high office required. But he was also impatient with meaningless ritual and empty formality. He cut down on the number of full-dress state visits and created his own style of personal diplomacy. James Reston of the New York Times described it in an article written during the presidency. Mr. Reston.
Ever since the days of Emerson and Thoreau, Americans have been writing about the importance of developing a distinctive American style. There are a lot of people around here now who think that maybe Kennedy is beginning to accomplish just that in the field of diplomacy. He has changed the mood and the tone of political expression in the capital, and he has done it with an unusual combination of informality, dignity, and wit. The decline of pretense and pomposity is the main thing. But if this were merely a change of style, it could be welcomed as an agreeable new aspect of political manners and forgotten. But it is more than that. It is a reflection of a serious effort by Kennedy to dispel some of the illusion of political life and deal with things as they are. His approach to Macmillan in their informal but searching private talks was, "Tell me what you can and cannot do about joining Europe, and I'll do the same." He continues to try to cut away the fat and get down to the bone. In the relaxed, let's get down to it style of Washington today, things can be discussed frankly. Differences are not only acknowledged but expressed. Difficulties are recognized and discussed, and there is even a vague concession of the obvious point, always concealed or denied before, that the world's problems are probably bigger than the men who have to deal with them. The atmosphere of the capital is not only a thing of manners, but of political substance.
During his 14 years in Congress, John Kennedy had been liked and respected by his colleagues. As president, he flooded Congress with proposals, and while the majority of his measures were passed, he also suffered some notable defeats. Some felt he was not effective in his relations with Congress. But perhaps more significantly, his difficulty was that he aimed for so much in so little time, both in the Congress and in the nation. The president's personal popularity was great, but he had been elected by the slimmest of margins. He faced a country not in the midst of any apparent great crisis. And his feeling of urgency about America's many very real problems was shared by relatively few. In his 1,000 days, he began a transformation of national values and purposes. The forcefulness of his own personality was the most potent instrument he had for awakening a desire for something new and better, and for dramatizing the wrongs that still afflicted America.
We need a permanent unemployment insurance program so that there are those who want to work and can't find a job will not be shifted and living on a marginal income without hope for themselves. These are things which other countries in Western Europe did 30 or 40 years ago. Great Britain, and we regard ourselves as a progressive society, had these provisions at the time of the First World War. And yet this is suggested as a most radical proposal. There is no reason why, if your skin is colored, you have twice as much chance to be unemployed, about a half as much chance to own your house, about a half or a third as much chance of your son or daughter going to college. This country is a free society in which everyone can succeed or fail based on what they have inside of them, not what they have outside. Imagine in this rich country of ours, 8 million children leaving before they finish the 12th grade. 1 out of 4 today out of work. The great lack, the most difficult places to find work in the 60s will be for those boys and girls without a good education and without training. And we want to make sure that every American has a chance to develop his talents. Education is basic to the preservation of a democracy. We are going to have twice as many of our sons and daughters trying to get into college in 1970 as tried in 1960. We have to, in the next 8 years, build as many school buildings as we've built in our entire history. And yet, we have found it extremely difficult to secure support for this vital program. We cannot leave the 17 million people who have retired and who may become ill. If they have no money, under the legislation now on the books, they have a chance to receive some as indigents. But that is not the way we believe it should be done. And if their son happens to have some money in the bank, they do not qualify. And he goes and pays out, and it may break him at a time when he has responsibilities to his children. Why it is so difficult to secure passage of a minimum wage, paying somebody in interstate commerce $1 or $1.10 or 15 cents, I do not understand. But it is regarded in some circles as highly radical and highly inflationary. For the first time, unemployed men can retire at 62. For the first time. And I do not regard this as a particularly radical proposal. Dependent children can receive aid for the first time in our history without the wage earner deserting his family. In the old days, before this act was passed, if a child was undernourished, it was necessary for the wage earner to desert his wife and family in order that those children should qualify for assistance. But last year that was changed. Now, I know there are some people who say that this isn't any business of the President of the United States, and who believe that the President of the United States should be the honorary chairman of a great fraternal organization and confine himself to ceremonial functions. But that isn't what the Constitution says. And I did not run for President of the United States to fulfill that office in that way. Harry Truman once said there are 14 or 15 million Americans who have the resources to have representatives in Washington to protect their interests. And that the interests of the great mass of the other people, the 150 or 60 million, is the responsibility of the President of the United States, and I propose to fulfill it. then I believe it is the business of the President of the United States to concern himself with the general welfare and the public interest. And if the people feel that it is not, then they should secure the services of a new President of the United States.
While President Kennedy felt deeply about his vision of America, displays of strong emotion were uncharacteristic. Essentially, he was a man of reason. Behind the informality and the easy humor was a sharply critical intelligence. In seeking change, he was willing to meet new problems in new ways, free from the ideologies and preconceptions of the past. The president's willingness to abandon tradition was responsible, in part, for his failure to succeed with the business community, in spite of efforts at conciliation. What he asked for was an open mind.
So how can we look at things as they are, not through party labels or through position labels, but as they are, and figure out how we can maintain this economy so that it moves ahead? What are your suggestions? And what are they specifically? Not in a general way. So that that's what I would like to see come out of this meeting. Because we cannot possibly solve these problems unless we have your goodwill and your ideas. I would like to also say a word about the difference between myth and reality. Most of us are conditioned for many years to have a political viewpoint, Republican or Democratic, liberal, conservative, moderate. The fact of the matter is that most of the problems, or at least many of them that we now face, are technical problems, are administrative problems. They're very sophisticated judgments, which do not lend themselves to the great sort of passionate movements which have stirred this country so often in the past. Now they deal with questions which are beyond the comprehension of most men, most governmental administrators, over which experts may differ, and yet we operate through our traditional political system.
One of the president's least dramatic but most significant efforts was his attempt to remove dogma from the American dialogue. His historic tax cut proposal was an outstanding example of his willingness to introduce new ideas based on the realities of a complex industrial society and a changing world. Nowhere was the president's appeal more effective than among the nation's youth. And nowhere was there a greater transformation. The president's own youthfulness and his gospel of criticism and hope made politics and even protest respectable. In the 1950s, the young men and women of the nation had been characterized as the silent generation, dominated by the feeling that nothing really mattered very much except one's own personal security. The generation of the 60s was no longer silent. The Peace Corps, which began recruiting and training volunteers early in 1961, was the symbol of a change in mood, the result of President Kennedy's effort to awaken popular idealism, especially in the young, and harness it to the service of the nation. The organizer of the Peace Corps, Sergeant Shriver.
I had spent a solid week with my family for the first time in 2 years. When the phone rang, it was the president on there, and he called a couple of times, and finally my wife said, "Sarge, you got to talk to Jack now. Remember, he's the president." And so I said, well, all right, I will. So about the third time I got on the phone, he said, listen, you've got to come down here to Washington to run the Peace Corps. I said, well, Mr. President, you know, I don't know anything about any Peace Corps. And he said, well, that's all right, neither does anybody else. And I said, but yes, but remember all the political debts you incurred during the campaign. Why don't you give this job to one of your political friends? He said, listen, Sarge, the truth of the matter is that everybody thinks the Peace Corps is going to be one of the greatest fiascos in history. If it turns out that way, it's much easier to fire a relative than a political friend.
I don't think it's altogether fair to say that I handed Sarge a lemon from which he made lemonade, but I do think that he was handed, and you were handed, one of the most sensitive and difficult assignments which any administrative group have been given almost in this century. The concept of the Peace Corps was entirely new. It was subjected to a great deal of criticism at the beginning. If it had not been done with such great care, and really in a sense loving and prideful care, it could have defeated a great purpose and could have set back the whole cause of public service internationally for a good many years.
In a short time, the Peace Corps gained the respect of its earlier critics. Its impact was great on the countries and the people it served. Its spirit was perhaps best expressed by a Peace Corps worker, later killed in an airplane accident, who wrote in a letter home, "Should it come to it, I had rather give my life trying to help someone than to have to give my life looking down a gun barrel at them." President Kennedy came to Latin America under the banner of a new approach, the Alliance for Progress. There had been nothing like it for almost 30 years. During the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had established the good neighbor policy and an era of goodwill. But our full attention was soon commanded by events in Europe, the rise of Hitler and the war against Germany. After Hitler's defeat, the Cold War became a consuming preoccupation, as did the massive problems of rebuilding a devastated Europe. During the 1950s, the Korean War and the threat of communist China made Asia an area of deep involvement. Inevitably, the 200 million people of Latin America were ignored. Our policy during most of the 50s was to seek stability, which often meant aligning ourselves with conservative regimes and giving apparent support to dictators such as Trujillo. When Vice President and Mrs. Nixon visited Latin America in 1958, the welcome they received made clear the resentment that had built up against the United States. From the outset, the Kennedy years marked a dramatic reversal of mood in Latin America.
Too long, my country, the wealthiest nation in a continent which is not wealthy, failed to carry out its full responsibilities to its sister republics. We have now accepted that responsibility. In the same way, those who possess wealth and power in poor nations must accept their own responsibilities. They must lead the fight for those basic reforms which alone can preserve the fabric of their societies. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
The tremendous inequities of life in Latin America, riches for a very few, abject poverty for the great majority, led President Kennedy to believe that revolutionary change was not only desirable, but inevitable. If the United States did not assist in achieving peaceful but basic reforms through its support of democratic governments, then the likely alternative was the violence of communist-inspired revolution.
These problems, the hard reality of life in much of Latin America, will not be solved simply by complaining about Castro, by blaming all problems on communism, or generals, or nationalism. The harsh facts of poverty and social injustice will not yield easily to promises or goodwill. The task we have set ourselves in the Alliance for Progress, the development of an entire continent, is a far greater task than any we have ever undertaken in our history. It will require difficult and painful labor over a long period of time.
The Alliance for Progress established a new direction in Latin American policy. And elsewhere in the world, toward the vast populations of the underdeveloped and emerging nations, the President also set a new course.
The great battleground for the defense and expansion of freedom today is the whole southern half of the globe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, the lands of the rising people. Their revolution is the greatest in human history. They seek an end to injustice, tyranny, and exploitation. More than an end, they seek a beginning.
In the years since World War II, some 40 new nations had been formed, containing nearly 1 billion people. If, during the age of Kennedy, the White House was often a miniature United Nations, it was because John Kennedy was the first American president for whom the whole world was, in a sense, domestic politics.
I want to express a very warm welcome to all of you. Being a student is a lonely experience. I spent some months in London, particularly in a free country where no one really cares very much about what happens to you when you sink or swim on your own resources. This is a valuable experience because the world is very much that way, and you will sink or swim on your own resources when you leave this country. We hope you, therefore, you have not felt that this is in any sense an abrupt or cold or uninterested society. It is wide open, unfinished, with innumerable problems of our own. The image of America, which is seen from abroad, is in many ways inaccurate. Our problems, in some ways, are more serious. Our riches are less. Our hopes are greater than may be imagined from far away. You have been close to us. We hope that you are generous in your judgment, even charitable, and we hope that you will be welcomed back some years from now as either the President, Prime Minister, or even more significant, the wife of a President or Prime Minister.
The President's contacts with foreign students were conducted with an eye toward the future. In the meantime, there were crises of the present that had to be met. In the former Belgian Congo, chaos had followed independence. President Kennedy's active support of the United Nations forces gave the UN its greatest success in peacekeeping and helped preserve the Congo as a nation. In Southeast Asia, civil war in Laos confronted the President with his first major crisis. Communist Pathet Lao rebels, with Russian support, were rapidly gaining control of the country from an unpopular right-wing government, which the Eisenhower administration had supported. The President tried to achieve a neutralized Laos.
We strongly and unreservedly support the goal of a neutral and independent Laos, tied to no outside power or group of powers, threatening no one, and free from any domination.
The President backed up his words with diplomatic and military action. The 7th Fleet moved into the China Sea, and 500 Marines were flown to the border of Laos to make clear our determination to prevent a communist victory. At the same time, the President urged a ceasefire, and his appeal was successful. Negotiations were begun under the leadership of Ambassador Averell Harriman. And after many months, a coalition government was formed. Although there were continuing problems, a near certain communist victory was averted, and Laos remained independent. In Vietnam, unlike Laos, President Kennedy's efforts to resolve a deepening crisis did not succeed. the president's attempt to change the military balance by increased aid to the hard-pressed South Vietnamese army failed to weaken the Viet Cong. While the president had hoped for a long-range political solution, South Vietnamese President Diem failed to initiate promised reforms. And the increasing repressiveness of his regime led to protests. And finally, at the beginning of November 1963, to Diem's overthrow and death. Not surprisingly, the Kennedy years were years of crisis among the emerging nations. But throughout them, the president held fast to an ultimate goal and to the projection of a larger vision.
I sometimes think we are too much impressed by the clamor of daily events. The newspaper headlines and the television screens give us a short view. They so flood us with the stop-press details of daily stories that we lose sight of one of the great movements of history. Wisdom requires the long view, and the long view shows us that the revolution of national independence is a fundamental fact of our era. This revolution will not be stopped, and it is in our own national interest that this revolution of national independence succeed. For the communists rest everything on the idea of a monolithic world, a world where all knowledge has a single pattern. All societies move towards a single model, and all problems and roads have a single solution and a single destination. And diversity and independence, far from being opposed to the American conception of the world order, represents the very essence of our view of the future of the world. We must reject oversimplified theories of international life. The theory that American power is unlimited, or that the American mission is to remake the world in the American image. We must seize the vision of a free and diverse world and shape our policies to speed progress towards a more flexible world order.
President Kennedy's trip to Europe in June 1963 represented his effort to move the European discussion beyond the frustrating technicalities of governmental relations and address himself directly to the European people to assure them of our goal of partnership, our respect for their independence, and our commitment to their defense. A German commentator wrote, "He spoke to us for the first time in the language of the present generation, a man who was able to project a vision of the future without moving an inch away from the reality of our time."
And there are even a few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us.
The Berlin Wall had been built in the summer of 1961 to stem the flow of refugees from East Germany into West Berlin. It remained a grim symbol of the enduring Cold War. President Kennedy had come to office and to his Vienna meeting with Khrushchev in June 1961, hoping that a rational approach would reduce friction with the Soviet Union.
Let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different.
But the meeting was a deeply disturbing experience for Kennedy. The Soviet premier had threatened him with the prospect of war over Berlin. The president's words on parting were, "It will be a cold winter." An American president in the age of the hydrogen bomb walks a dangerous path between protecting his nation's vital interests and risking nuclear annihilation. President Kennedy had adopted a defense policy based on a strong nuclear deterrent, but also on an increased variety of conventional weapons in order to provide a range of choices between the extremes of humiliation and extinction. The president also recognized that in the nuclear age, there was no such thing as total victory.
We need military commanders who are conscious of the enormous stakes in the nuclear age of every decision that they take, who are aware of the fact that there are no purely political decisions or purely military decisions, that every problem is a mixture of both. We live in a world, in short, where the principal problems that we face are not susceptible to military solutions alone.
In a world only minutes away from destruction, there was also the danger of unintentional nuclear war. Not so much from the remote possibility of accident, but from the real chance of miscalculation.
Now, if you look at the history of this century, where World War I really came through a series of misjudgments of the intentions of others. Certainly World War II, where Hitler thought that he could seize Poland, the British might not fight. If they fought, that after the defeat of Poland, they might not continue to fight. Korea, where obviously the North Koreans didn't think we were going to come in. And Korea, when we didn't think the Chinese were going to come in. And you look at all those misjudgments which brought on war, and then you see the Soviet Union and the United States so far separated in their beliefs, you put the nuclear equation into that struggle. That's what makes this such a dangerous time, and one mistake can make this whole thing blow up. When that day comes, and there's a massive exchange, then that's the end.
October 19th, 1962. As far as all but a tiny handful of Americans were concerned, the president was simply enjoying a campaign swing through the Midwest, trying to build a strong Democratic vote for the November elections. But in between the speeches and the handshaking, the president was in constant touch with the White House. The subject, once more, was Cuba. After Vienna, President Kennedy had predicted that there might have to be a moment of supreme risk before Khrushchev would be convinced that conciliation did not mean weakness, and before the world could be led beyond the Cold War. That moment came in October 1962 with the missile crisis. In a series of meetings lasting over several days, the American response to the threat of Russian missiles in Cuba was determined. At first, the choice seemed to lie between doing nothing, which the president refused to accept, or an airstrike against the missile sites, which could easily provoke nuclear war. An alternative finally emerged, the conception of a naval blockade, designed to stop the further entry of offensive weapons into Cuba and hopefully to force the removal of the missiles already there. The president chose the blockade.
There was some disagreement with the course we finally adopted, but the course we finally adopted had the advantage of permitting other steps if this one was unsuccessful. In other words, we were starting, in a sense, at a minimum place.
Before and during the blockade, the president maintained tight personal control of every aspect of the situation. The Bay of Pigs had not been in vain. When the crisis was over, Khrushchev could claim to the Supreme Soviet that understanding had been reached as a result of mutual concessions and compromise. At every stage, Kennedy had given his adversary time for reflection and reappraisal, and had allowed him an honorable retreat.
We must therefore persevere in the search for peace in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
In December 1961, the president's father suffered a serious stroke, and President Kennedy hurried to be with him. Tragedy had always haunted John Kennedy's life. He could have been describing himself when he said of the poet Robert Frost,
His sense of the human tragedy fortified him against self-deception and easy consolation. And because he knew the midnight as well as the high noon, because he understood the ordeal as well as the triumph of the human spirit, he gave his age strength with which to overcome despair.
It was in character for him to observe,
There is always an equity in life. Some men are killed in a war, and some men are wounded, and some men never leave the country, and some men are stationed in the Antarctic, and some are stationed in San Francisco. It's very hard in military or in personal life to assure complete equality. Life is unfair.
But if life was unfair, it was far from meaningless. President Kennedy welcomed life, its challenges and its joys. President Kennedy took great joy in his family, and in spite of the heavy burdens, he enjoyed being president.
I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency, and whether you could recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others. At least for a while.
President Kennedy enjoyed the exercise of power, but he also had the detachment to recognize the dangers and the limitations of power.
The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness. But the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when that questioning is disinterested. For they determine whether we use power or power uses us. When power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses.
The president was a complex man, yet the diverse elements all fitted together: the sense of hope, the acceptance of challenge, the awareness of man's limitations.
And we must face the fact that the United States is neither omnipotent nor omniscient, that we are only 6% of the world's population, and that we cannot impose our will upon the other 94% of mankind, that we cannot right every wrong or reverse each adversity, and that therefore there cannot be an American solution to every world problem. We've got great unfinished business in this country. And while this bill does not solve our problems in this area, I do not believe it is a valid argument to say this bill isn't going to do the job. It will not. But it will do part of it. Our housing bill last year for the elderly, that won't do the job, but it will begin. When we retrain workers, that won't take care of unemployment chronically in some areas, but it's a start. We aren't able overnight to solve all the problems that this country faces. But is that any good reason why we should say, let's not even try? That's what we're going to do today. We are trying. We are trying. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Above all, President Kennedy was appropriate to his time. Historian Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. summed it up when he wrote, "He voiced the disquietude of the post-war generation, the mistrust of rhetoric, the disdain for pomposity, the impatience with the postures and pieties of other days, the resignation to disappointment." And he also voiced the new generation's longings for fulfillment and experience, for the subordination of selfish impulses to higher ideals, for a link between past and future, for adventure and valor and honor. What was forbidden were poses, histrionics, the heart on the sleeve and the tongue on the cliché. What was required was a tough, nonchalant acceptance of the harsh present and an open mind toward the unknown future.
Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal.
President Kennedy was so contemporary a man, so involved in our world, so immersed in our times, so responsive to its challenges, that he seemed the very symbol of the vitality and the exuberance that is the essence of life itself. Now he's gone. Today we mourn him. Tomorrow and tomorrow we shall miss him. And so we shall never know how different the world might have been had fate permitted this blazing talent to live and labor long, man's unfinished agenda for peace and progress for all.